Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with Standards Plus History Academy. We finished up the House Select Committee yesterday, and we learned that the House Select Committee had been compromised by the CIA through infiltration, first by Richard Billings, and of course we learned that the day before. He helped write the report, and then yesterday George Joannides, and how he became the filter. He was supposed to be the liaison between the CIA and the House Select Committee as they requested and got access to documents. He turned out to be a filter. And I spent considerable amount of time in yesterday's episode reading Blakey's uh, statement, which came out in 2003, subsequent to him learning about Joannides and his interference and how he was actually put there to obstruct and deny. And furthermore, his experience or his background, having worked with the anti-Castro groups and with Lee Harvey Oswald, who was also working with those anti-Castro groups during the lead up to the JFK assassination, specifically the DRE groups that were targeting Castro at first, Kennedy second. Here he is involved in the sheep dipping of Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. Now he's part of the investigation. And of course, that compromised everything. And Blakey realized that. This is after the CIA pulled a power play and got Downing removed, got Sprague removed from the committee, replaced Downing with Gonzalez and eventually Stokes, who replaced Sprague with Blakey. And the combination of all these factors gave the CIA inside access, inside control, actually, over who would be named conspirators ultimately in the report. And they used congressmen to help fan the flames, their mockingbird media, their captured media, to take it and run with it, to get Downing removed, to get Sprague removed. And that's how they were able to co-opt and take control of the House Select Committee. Today, and we always do this when we finish one of the investigations, we always get into the culture of death and go through some prominent names, people who died during this particular investigation. I've got it circled here. As you can see, this is the highest number. When you talk about the deaths spiking during the investigations, you can see, obviously, during the Warren Commission, you had quite a spike. But the sheer number of deaths during House Select Committee outnumbers all the previous investigations. And I mean, you're talking about some prominent names. So I'm not going to try to do it all in one day. It would take too long. I divided it into 2 days. As you can see, I've got the years circled there. My year of focus is 77, 78. But then there are a couple that reach back to 75 and a couple that reach forward to 79. But you see the number there, 39. And that's the highest number that we've addressed so far. Some of these names should be familiar if you've been following along in the episodes. This guy for sure, Sheffield Edwards. We talked about Sheffield Edwards in the context of the Fontainebleau meeting, of the Nixon's desire to put together an S-force. Santos Trafficante wanted evidence, wanted somebody there representing Nixon, so he knew that it was coming from what he thought was going to be the future president of the United States, and he wasn't going to be left hanging out to dry. So in the next meeting, that Sheffield Edwards, the director of security for the CIA, showed up to represent Nixon. Joined the CIA after World War II and was appointed head of the Office of Security. And his main job in that capacity was to protect agency personnel and facilities from enemy penetration. In other words, his job was to prevent counterintel from other countries from penetrating or turning some of their agents into double agents. In April of 1950, one of Edwards' projects was something called Project Bluebird. And as such, they set up teams to check out agents and defectors for the CIA. People would come to the CIA claiming to be defecting to the United States. And of course, we had a fake defector program, so the CIA was obviously aware that other countries may have fake defectors trying to infiltrate our spy agency as well. So his job as leader of these teams was to put together a group of people, including a psychiatrist, a polygraph expert, somebody trained in hypnosis, where you could hypnotize somebody, try to get the truth out of them, a technician, somebody who runs all the equipment. These teams would be utilized in case-by-case situations to try to determine if a person was a real defector or not, or a real agent or a double agent. All right, so that's the minutia, the detail of his job. In 1953, Allen Dulles asked Edwards to investigate CIA officers who had gotten caught up in the McCarthy hearings. McCarthy had, if you know anything about the McCarthy period, he came out with lists of people. He said he'd wave it around in his campaign speeches and say, on this list are a bunch of names from the Department of State or intelligence agencies, FBI, whatever, of security risks, which code meant that they had some kind of communist tie. And the two officials that McCarthy named that drew special interest of Sheffield Edwards, per the request of Allen Dulles, was Cord Meyer and Frank Wisner. These are pretty high-ranking guys. You remember Cord Meyer was the husband of Mary Pinchot, the lady who had an affair with JFK, ended up being shot and killed. Cord Meyer was linked to the JFK assassination by E. Howard Hunt. He was also involved very closely with Frank Wisner in Operation Mockingbird. And of course, Wisner was in charge of Operation Mockingbird. Anyway, in 1960, we know that the CIA decided to work closely with the mafia to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. And according to Richard Bissell, this is Bissell pictured here on the right with Allen Dulles on the left. These are the two that made the decision. And of course, Richard Bissell was heavily involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. So as was Allen Dulles. These two would end up getting fired by JFK after the Bay of Pigs, along with Cabell, General Cabell. According to Bissell, again, pictured here on the right with the dark rimmed glasses, it was Sheffield Edwards who first suggested the idea of working with the mafia. And the advantage that Sheffield Edwards argued was that it provides the CIA with cover if, for some reason, the operation were to be exposed or go bad or whatever. They could always argue that the mafia, which had a lot of motive to want to get back into Cuba and get rid of Castro, it could be argued that they went off on their own, went rogue, and it was this private group of people trying to get rid of Castro. So their thinking was we could use the mafia to do our dirty work for us. And if things go south, we can burn them. We can blame it on that. We can disavow any knowledge. We have plausible deniability. We have cover, which, by the way, is what Santos Trafficante realized when he was asked to put together the S-Force. He said, fine, but I want to make sure I have cover. And that's why he asked for Sheffield Edwards' presence. That's why he recruited back his own men that were on loan to the CIA for Operation 40. He recruited them back to work in the S-Force because those guys had been paid by the CIA for the past couple of years in an operation under the umbrella of the CIA. He knew, as such, the CIA could never allow them to be exposed because it led back to the CIA. That was a pretty smart move on Santos Trafficante's part. So Edwards suggested that if you're going to have the mafia involved, your contact person needs to be Robert Mayhew. We told the story from the Howard Hughes angle. Robert Mayhew was working as Howard Hughes' attorney. He was approached he was actually ordered by Hughes after the phone call from Nixon to get started on this. Of course, he made the contact with Johnny Rosselli. According to Jack Anderson, Mayhew offered the contract to Johnny Rosselli, who said, well, we've got to get my boss involved. And of course, his boss was Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana says, well, we have to get Santo involved because it's any hit on Cuban territory has to get the approval of the mafioso who's in charge of that territory, and that's Santos Trafficante. As Mayhew pointed out, quote, both were among the 10 most powerful mafia members in America. And Mayhew told both of them at this first meeting that the CIA was willing to pay $150,000 to have Castro killed, at which point he was informed by both of them they'd do it for nothing. And speaking to that obvious motivation that they had. That was the first round of meetings. On March 12, 1961, Mayhew and Sheffield Edwards #2, a man named Jim O'Connell, met at the same hotel again, this time with Rosselli, Trafficante, and Giancani. And this is when Jim O'Connell gave the poison pills and $10,000 to Rosselli to be used against Fidel Castro. Okay, so what that shows is that Edwards went to his bosses, Richard Bissell and Alan Dulles, said, you know, if we want to kill Castro, we really need to get the mafia involved. He was thinking it would provide cover, but he was also thinking they probably had the best shot at getting it done because Santos Trafficante had access to Cubans, and these were motivated refugees. These were expats from Cuba who wanted to get rid of Castro as well. The mafia had the best hitmen anyway, so let's engage with them as partners to get rid of Castro. So what that story tells us that Sheffield Edwards was not just Nixon's emissary sent down to represent Nixon. He was fully engaged in the plot, and according to Jack Anderson, was sort of the ringleader of the plot. Anyway, on July 5th, 1975, Sheffield Edwards died. There doesn't seem to be any controversy about his death. I'm just noting that happened on July of 1975. And that is a prominent figure who dies right at the beginning as this House Select Committee is being organized and put together. This one should ring a bell. William Harvey, another central player in all of this. We've discussed him several times as being sort of the assassin's assassin, involved in just about every assassination the CIA was ever involved in. His story goes back to 47 when he joins the CIA after he was fired or resigned, depends on your perspective, from the FBI in 47. According to Richard Mahoney, William J. Harvey, quote, was a squat, balding tank of a man with eyes that bulged because of a thyroid condition. And shortly after he joined the CIA, he began assembling a squad of assassins recruited from the ranks of organized criminals in Europe. This is the genesis of the ZR rifle program, of which he was in charge of. And their job was to assassinate people that the United States government had issues with. And that's what they did. Later, he was involved in Executive Action, a program we learned about as a result of the church hearings and the family jewels, the documents, the internal CIA documents that came from directors Colby and Schlesinger. And this was a plan to remove unfriendly foreign leaders from power. So ZR Rifle was Harvey's group of assassins that would pretty much kill indiscriminately lower level type people. Executive Action was going after foreign heads of state, and included in one of the operations that Executive Action was a part of was the overthrow of the Guatemalan government of Arbenz in 1954. Of course, there were many others. That's just one. In March of 60, Eisenhower approved a CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro. So this didn't start with Kennedy. This started before Kennedy, obviously with Eisenhower and Nixon. The and of course, this is what we're referring to as the Bay of Pigs. The plan involved a budget of $13 million, and it was to train these Cubans who had fled to Miami and were anxious to get back to Cuba. And the CIA decided we're going to train these guys for a paramilitary operation, which we can, of course, disavow. It'll appear to be homegrown. It's a grassroots thing that, and it won't have American fingerprints all over it. Well, of course, it didn't happen. Under Eisenhower and Nixon, it carried over into Kennedy, and the first 3 months of his presidency happened in that April. It turned into a total disaster. And so Kennedy afterwards was faced with the decision, do we continue to try to get rid of Castro, or do I abandon the effort because of what happened at Bay of Pigs? Kennedy doubles down, and he creates his own committee called the SGA. And later, this, of course, this is what he just remember when he made that promise to Khrushchev that all the Operation 40 stuff was going to stop. All he did was change the name. And so they called it, instead of Operation 40, they called it Operation Mongoose. And one of the headquarters of this Operation Mongoose was down in Miami at the JM Wave Station. And the guy who was running this was Ted Shackley. And one of his first decisions was to appoint William Harvey as head of an operation called Task Force W. Harvey's job was to organize just a broad range of activities to help bring down Castro's government. So what we see so far with Harvey in his history with the CIA is that he's an assassin. He's involved with ZR Rifle. He's kind of in charge of it. And then executive action, which is an assassination program to depose foreign heads of state. And now he's been put in charge of a task force to try to complicate things for Castro, because that is the next target of executive action. On March 12, 1961, it was Harvey who arranged, acting on the orders of Sheffield Edwards, whom we just discussed, for CIA operative Jim O'Connell to meet at the Fontainebleau with those poison pills and that $10,000 cash, which he gives to Rosselli to be used against Fidel Castro. Richard Mahoney, in his book Sons and Brothers, says about Harvey, quote, late one evening, probably March 13, Rosselli passed the poison pills and the money to a small reddish-haired Afro-Cuban by the name of Rafael Macho Guiner in the Boom Boom Room, a location Giancana thought stupid. Rosselli's purpose, however, was not just to assassinate Castro, but to set up the mafia's partner in crime, the U.S. government. Accordingly, he was laying a long, bright trail of evidence that unmistakably implicated the CIA in the Castro plot. And this is key right here. This evidence, whose purpose was blackmail, would prove critical in the CIA's cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. In other words, this association with the mafia to kill Castro was one of the reasons why Allen Dulles was put on the Warren Commission to cover up any trails that might lead back, because obviously if there is an honest investigation of JFK's death, it's going to involve these anti-Castro organizations, the mafia, and it's all going to lead back to the CIA, and they can't have that. So that's what Mahoney is saying. This evidence, she's talking about the mafia's clever working of this by Santos Trafficante, also by Johnny Rosselli, to lay a trail like Hansel and Gretel right back to the CIA. When the JFK assassination happened, the powers that be realized where this would lead. And so Allen Dulles had to be put on the Warren Commission to stave off any trail that led back to the CIA. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is where Harvey starts to get into some situations with the powers that be. Robert Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Robert Kennedy instructed John McCone, the new leader of the CIA, to stop Operation Mongoose, to stop any operation aimed at Cuba. This is because his brother has just made another promise to Nikita that we will never invade, he's president, he will never invade Cuba again. And so he's, after breaking his promise after Bay of Pigs, he's got to keep it this time. We can't have another Cuban Missile Crisis. A few days later, Bobby Kennedy finds out that Harvey just ignored the order and went on his own with different commando teams into Cuba because Harvey was trying to instigate an invasion. In other words, Harvey's just ignoring the White House. So Kennedy, obviously Bobby tells his brother. And so when the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, Harvey gets fired from his job as commander of ZR Rifle. And October 30, 1962, Bobby terminates all sabotage operations against Cuba. This is when they went down and closed down JM Wave, closed down all the bases around Lake Pontchartrain and the Everglades and No Name Key, all these bases that had been training these anti-Castroites to invade Cuba, they all got shut down. And JFK took their weapons, took their ammo, took their explosives, and just shut everything down. Of course, this infuriated the anti-Castro community, infuriated the CIA, infuriated people like William Harvey. To get rid of Harvey, the Kennedys banished him to Italy. He became chief of station in Rome. They thought, we'll get him out of sight, out of mind, and he won't be around to cause any problems in our hemisphere anymore. Of course, Harvey knew the source of all this, and he hated Bobby Kennedy. A friend of Harvey's said that he hated Bobby Kennedy's guts with purple passion. And so anyway, throughout this time in Rome, Harvey continues to keep contact with Johnny Rosselli. Again, Richard Mahoney in that same book says, quote, on April 8th, Rosselli flew to New York to meet with Bill Harvey. A week later, the two men met again in Miami to discuss the plot in greater detail. He's talking about the plot to kill JFK. On April 21, he flew from Washington to deliver, Castro. He flew from Washington to deliver 4 poison pills directly to Rosselli, that meeting we talked about, who got them to Tony Verona and hence to Havana. That same evening, Harvey and Ted Shackley, the chief of CIA's JM Wave base, drove a U-Haul truck filled with requested arms through the rain to a deserted parking lot in Miami. They got out and they handed the keys to Rosselli. This guy is connected all the way up into the assassination in Dallas. We learned earlier that he actually, from Rome, made a trip in the weeks right prior to Dallas, right prior to the assassination of JFK. He made a trip to Dallas. And when he was asked by someone in Rome, what's he going to Dallas for? He said, quote, to look around. E. Howard Hunt said on his deathbed that, and this came out in the 6th investigation we're going to talk about with Marita Lorenz, that Harvey had actually, that Miami meeting that we just discussed, that's where he recruited several people into the plot, including E. Howard Hunt, to kill Kennedy. And they are going to make a run from Miami to Dallas with a trunk full of weapons, and they're going to meet in a Dallas hotel room. This was all organized by Bill Harvey. There's literally no assassination that the CIA was involved in, according to many witnesses, that Harvey was not in charge of during this period of time. Anyway, he dies in June of 1976 as a result of complications from heart surgery. We've already learned but because of the death of J. Edgar Hoover, that the CIA had a certain kind of poison that if you ingested would cause heart seizures and cause somebody to die of heart problems. And in that context, we learned that poison had been planted at J. Edgar Hoover's home in his toiletry items, and a couple weeks later, he died. So here's William Harvey, at the beginning of the House Select Committee. No doubt he's going to be one of the guys called. He's going to be one of its the witnesses they're going to want to speak to, dies of complications from heart surgery in June 1976. Now, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just telling you what happened. He was not a healthy guy. He was, as we've already learned, he's got a thyroid condition. He was already on medication. He was overweight. He was a heavy drinker, heavy smoker. He lived kind of a life of excess. And so it's possible he died of legitimately of natural causes. But the timing is awful interesting. There's another important guy, William Pauley, January 7th, 1977. In June of 63, we told the story about Pauley's 65-foot yacht and how it was taking the S-Force on a mission to kill Castro, but also to smuggle two Soviet, what they said were defectors, out of Cuba. And that's the time that Richard Billings was on the boat recording everything that was happening. He was going to tell the story. And on that boat, they had that exchange. William Pauley, who is transporting the S-Force, was talking to John Martino. Martino was a mafia security specialist. William Rip Robertson was on that boat. He was the trainer of the S-Force at that Murchison's ranch down in Mexico. Eddie Bayo was on that boat. He's a anti-Castro member of Alpha 66, which you remember, that's the group that Oswald had infiltrated, that was attempting to kill JFK, planning to kill JFK, was going to blame it on Oswald. Anyway, they're all on this boat along with other operatives, and they're waiting for the S-Force to return from their operation. And of course, the goal in all this is why Richard Billings was there, was to write a big story about these two colonels and how the Soviets had not removed their missiles from Cuba, despite the assurances to Kennedy. And it was to embarrass him, make him look like he had made an agreement with somebody he couldn't trust. As far as Pauley was concerned, we didn't really get into his background other than to say he was heavily connected to the CIA. His official resume was that he was a businessman and he'd made millions of dollars in real estate. He owned an airline, public transportation, specifically down in Cuba under Batista. He organized the Flying Tigers in China during World War II. Afterwards, he was an ambassador to Peru, Brazil. This guy was a kind of like a Renaissance man, but he had an unofficial resume because he was very close friends with Allen Dulles, and he used his business covers, or I should say, Dulles used Pauley's business covers to help him carry out CIA tasks. He was involved in the Guatemala coup. He had a good relationship from his World War II days with President Eisenhower, so he was helpful in convincing Eisenhower to improve the Bay of Pigs plant. He was just one of these guys that had connections officially and unofficially. He's kind of like a Howard Hughes in that sense. Anyway, he was a rabid anti-communist. So if there was any mission CIA was involved in, it could be explained as an anti-communist mission. You could mark my words, Pauley was involved. After the Bay of Pigs, after the Bay of Pigs disaster, he was like all the anti-Castorites. He was really upset with JFK. Yeah, remember this operation was approved under Eisenhower. Eisenhower was his guy. Well, Eisenhower is no longer the president. There's a new president, and there were other cases like the Guatemala case, for example. It was going south, and when Eisenhower was president, he did send in the U.S. military to bail out the CIA in that case. Everyone fully expected if the Cuba operation went south, the new president would do the same as Eisenhower had done prior. You can't sacrifice the mission. You can't sacrifice the credibility of the United States government. But JFK, in their view, did. And they viewed that as a betrayal. And he also believed that there were Castro sympathizers in the State Department that allowed Cuba to be lost to Castro. So he was kind of like, and this was the times, the McCarthy hearings and all that. McCarthy was making all these accusations against the State Department for these security risks and these communists that were embedded in the State Department. William Pauley agreed with that. He was fully on board with what McCarthy was doing. On May 9th, 1962, according to witnesses, JFK asked Pauley, in this unofficial advisor capacity, what do you think I should do about Cuba? This is after the Bay of Pigs. Pauley said, I think we have to drop 10,000 Marines in Havana. In other words, he, like all the other military advisors, CIA advisors, was saying he was advocating for a full-fledged invasion of Cuba. And of course, Kennedy's never going to do that. He had already made a promise to Khrushchev. He realizes he's already breaking it by subversively trying to get rid of Castro. He's not going to land 10,000 Marines in Havana and risk a war with the Soviet Union. So he never asked Pauley's advice again. Pauley, because of his background, he is engaged with the CIA as a wildcat sponsor of, quote, off-the-shelf covert ops versus Cuba. So there's evidence that the DRE, that same group that we talked about yesterday, I forget his Joannides was involved in, was performing intelligence operations around Cuba using speedboats. William Pauley was involved in that. And the Flying Tiger, which we've already talked about, which it's his yacht, and he's taken the S-Force to Cuba. And this operation, the Flying Tiger operation, failed ultimately. Now I've heard different things. I've heard that some of the Cubans Castro had spied it out with his spies in Miami, knew it was coming, and that he lured them into a trap and arrested them when they landed and executed them. There's another story that the speedboat was overloaded with these S-Force assassins and it sank before they even reached shore, and the mission failed. Ultimately, what we do know for a fact is that those S-Force people that were dropped off from his yacht to sneak ashore Cuba never returned. And eventually they have to sail away with an empty boat. So it never did succeed. Anyway, back to that yacht. And you remember that story, that interaction between him and Martino. Martino was ranting and raving. JFK shut down all the bases. He's taken the weapons. He's arrested E. Howard Hunt, and he's arrested Frank Sturgis because they were violating the Neutrality Act. And he's just ranting and raving. And that's when Pauley turns around and says, don't worry, John, we're going to kill that MFer. This was, as I said earlier, reported by Richard Billings, who was on the boat to tell the CIA story of this operation, which they still held hope on at that moment, that it was going to succeed. January 7th, 1977, 1 week after being targeted by the House Select Committee on Assassinations for an interview, the 80-year-old Pauley was found dying of a bullet wound to his chest. And of course, it was ruled a suicide. And here are the articles about that death. So if you're the House Select Committee, boy, this sounds awful suspicious, awfully similar to what happened to Judge Jim Garrison as he's preparing for trial of Clay Shaw. One by one, all the important witnesses are dying, leaving him with nothing, just destroying his case. Here's the House Select Committee as it's preparing to get off the ground. And, if you were preparing a witness list already, you've lost 3 really key guys. Sheffield Edwards is the link, or the guy that could explain the link between the CIA and the mafia. According to witnesses, he was the guy who came up with that idea. William Harvey, there wasn't an assassination that happened during that period that he wasn't involved in. So you're going to question William Harvey. And William Pauley, who the House Select Committee knows has been involved in all of these off-the-shelf operations, involved with the S-Force. What he said to John Martino, according to Richard Billings, he's going to be, it already says here, he was going to be, he was already targeted by the House Select Committee. So all three of them have died before they can say a word to the House Select Committee. And so, boy, the timing of that is so suspicious. Fast forward to March 29, 1977. So I'm just kind of going in chronological order here. March 29. This is a picture on the right of Charles Nicoletti. Charles Nicoletti, according to several accounts, including James Files, was in the Daltex building, and his spotter was Johnny Rosselli. They got access to the building from Eugene Braden, who had a contact inside that building. Anyway, this guy was a leading figure in the mafia in Chicago. He worked under Tony Accardo and later Sam Giancana, and he was basically a contract killer for the family. He was also involved in the CIA plots to overthrow Castro. He had two bosses, just like Files had two bosses. He had the boss number one in Chicago. He had boss number two, the CIA. And so he floated back and forth. And that's why I say there's like two heads of the same coin, the CIA and the mafia and these Cubans. I mean, they're all mixed up together. They all have the same agenda, and that's to get rid of Castro. So they're working together. And according to Files, Nicoletti's was one of the gunmen. And as we mentioned before, on March 29, 1977, Nicoletti was murdered in Chicago. He was shot 3 times in the back of the head. Now, on the same day, states away down in Florida, George de Mohrenschildt was also found dead. Both men had already been requested and were scheduled to appear before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, where they were going to be asked about their involvement in the JFK assassination. March 29, 1977. And George de Mohrenschildt down in Florida and Charles Nicoletti up in Chicago. Same day. And the thing that unites them or links them is the fact that they'd already been requested to appear before the HSCA. So let's talk about George de Mohrenschildt. Who's this guy? Well, on October 7th of 62, it was de Mohrenschildt who met Lee Harvey Oswald for the first time and convinced Lee to move from Fort Worth to Dallas. And within 1 week, he helped Oswald, who was a recent defector from Russia, right, get a job where it was going to be required that he have top security clearances, making charts and maps for the Pentagon at Jagger Stovall Childs. Jagger Stovall Childs in Dallas. It was George de Mohrenschildt who got him that job. And you say, well, who's George de Mohrenschildt? Well, this guy, he wasn't from America. He's actually from Russia. His father had been a governor of the province of Minsk during the time that the czars were running Russia. And during the Communist Revolution, the whites versus the reds, his family fled in 1917. George de Mohrenschildt, because of his family and the way they moved around, spoke Russian, he spoke French, he spoke German, Spanish, Polish, and English. I mean, this guy was a learned guy. During World War II, he worked for the French intelligence. He had a doctorate degree, a master's and a doctorate, and his expertise was in petroleum engineering and international commerce, which obviously, if you're doing petroleum engineering, you're going to be involved in lots of different locations in different countries. And so all of this expertise in these different languages and his background in intelligence really played a part in helping making him a very successful businessman. By the time he meets Oswald, he'd spent time in Ghana, Haiti, Guatemala, Yugoslavia. Obviously, because of his family's background, having fled Russia during the Communist Revolution, he was a lifelong anti-communist and pro-capitalist. And now, just on his own, he's meeting somebody who was a defector to Russia, claimed to be a communist, a Marxist-Leninist, and becoming intimately involved with this guy makes no sense. According to researcher Gregory Burnham, Mohrenschildt was an active member of two CIA proprietary organizations, the Dallas Council on World Affairs and the Crusade for a Free Europe. So this guy is CIA. And in 1977, shortly before he died, literally 1 month before he died, de Mohrenschildt confessed to William Oltmans, who was writing a story on him, quote, talking about Oswald, he says, "I am responsible. I feel responsible for the behavior of Lee Harvey Oswald because I guided him." In other words, what he's saying is he was Oswald's handler. When Oswald was in Texas, de Mohrenschildt was his handler. He says, "I guided him." That's why he convinced him to move from Fort Worth to Dallas. And of course, he's handling Oswald for the CIA. He's not making this up on his own. He's not doing this for his own purposes. The CIA gave him an assignment. You are to handle Lee Harvey Oswald. We don't want him living in Fort Worth. We need him living in Dallas. We need him, get him this job. And so de Mohrenschildt is following orders. He has no connection or identification with Oswald. He's an anti-communist. Oswald's playing the part of a pro-communist. He fled Russia. Oswald went to Russia as a fake defector. Now, they're both in the CIA. Okay. And so they're both playing their parts. But as an asset, Oswald would have a handler. He always had a handler. When he was in New Orleans, it was Guy Bannister. When he was in Dallas, early, it was George de Mohrenschildt. Late, right before the assassination of Ruth Paine, he always had a handler. Early in his life, it was David Ferry. He always had a handler. So this is his handler during this period. On March 29th, before lunch, this is, of course, the D-Day, this is the day he dies, he's talking to Edward J. Epstein from Reader's Digest, and Epstein's doing an article on him. And he says that in 1962, he was contacted by J. Walton Moore, who was a CIA employee in Dallas. Moore asked him at this meeting to find out about Oswald's time in the Soviet Union. In other words, he's recommending that he become Oswald's handler. In return, if you'll do this for us, for the CIA, for the agency, he says, we will help you with an oil deal that you're trying to negotiate in Haiti. So, and sure enough, in March of 63, de Mohrenschildt got the contract that he was seeking from the Haitian government. All right, so he's telling Epstein this. He's saying, you know, I didn't seek this meeting with Oswald. I was assigned, I was asked to do this in exchange for help getting a business deal. So it was business. He did this, all of his interaction with Oswald, all of his guiding of Oswald, his handling of Oswald was a business deal. He was trying to get an oil deal in Haiti, so he was doing what the CIA asked him to do. So they break for lunch, he and Epstein. And after lunch, de Mohrenschildt returns to his room for lunch and found an invite there to meet with Gaten Fonzi. Now, if you remember Gaten Fonzi is the chief investigator for the HSCA. He'd been brought in with Sprague. Now, Sprague had already resigned and was gone. He'd been brought in with Downing. Downing had already been fired, replaced. He'd resigned and he was gone. And now the guys running it are Stokes and Blakey. But Fonzie's still hired on as the investigator. And Fonzie had tracked him down. And he had come while he was gone for lunch, missed him, and he'd left an invite saying, I'd like to meet with you. And of course, this is the precursor to being invited to testify or asked to testify to the HSCA. Later that day, de Mohrenschildt is found by his daughter, dead of a massive gunshot wound to the head. There was a 20-gauge double-barreled shotgun lying on the floor next to his body. The death, of course, is ruled a suicide. De Mohrenschildt's wife, pictured here on the right, said, quote, I do not accept that he committed suicide. They may get me too, but I'm not afraid. It's about time somebody looked into this thing. And she's talking about the House Select Committee and the what they're doing investigating the JFK assassination. So there's another witness who right before he was supposed to testify to the HSCA, or being invited to testify, at least to talk to the investigator at Gate and Fonzie, but probably going to be asked to testify to the committee at large. Right before that, he's found dead, and of course, it's ruled a suicide. That's March 29th. Literally 6 days later, April 5th, 1977, Carlos Prio is found dead. This guy is, you're talking about a pretty prominent guy in Cuban politics. He, in 1933, helped depose the Cuban dictator Machado, and he became the Minister of Labor under the new Cuban president, Ramon Grau. In 1948, he replaced Grau, and he becomes the president of Cuba. And one of the things that he'd promised to the Cuban people, it had sort of endeared him to the Cuban people, is that he was going to get the mafia out of Cuba. He did not keep his promise. They paid him off. And he became very, very rich during his period as president in Cuba. And of course, a lot of folks were very disappointed in Carlos Prio because he did not keep that promise. In 1952, so he was in charge 4 years. Fulgencio Batista, with our backing, ousted Prio and took control of the country. Now, Batista is going to be the guy, he's our puppet, and he's the one that's going to facilitate all of the business entanglements that our sugar companies, our electric companies, utilities, public transportation, the mafiosos, the CIA with the Golden Triangle and all the heroin coming through Cuba. I mean, Batista is going to be our guy who's going to make Cuba basically an ATM machine for the United States. He's going to be in control for the next 7-8 years. Prio, this is how it's done in these Latin American countries. When you're in charge, you're in charge. But when you're not, you better flee or you're going to end up dead. So he fled to the United States. And obviously, his antagonist during this period is going to be Batista. And so in the 50s, he supported the efforts of Castro to overthrow Batista. However, after Castro took power in 1959, and he realized, and Prio and him had a falling out, and so he broke with Castro in 1959 and just decided to stay in the United States. I think up until 1959, 1960, he was kind of trying to go back home, but he wanted to go back home as president. And so he supported Castro to get rid of Batista. He saw him as a vehicle by which he could retain power. But then when Castro took power and Prio realized, all I did was help. All I did was facilitate the transfer of power from one to another, and I'm still out in the cold. He just kind of decided at that point to stay in Miami, and he became a property developer and a businessman in Miami and did very well. Well, according to witnesses, Prio became involved in the anti-Castro stuff that was going on. Of course, Miami is the epicenter of all that. So he became involved in Bay of Pigs. And as such, because he's in the company of these people that later would be involved in the assassination of JFK, these witnesses say that Prio had information on the assassination of JFK and was linked in testimony with Jack Ruby and Frank Sturgis. Jack Ruby, if you remember, he was kind of in that same boat with Prio. He was running guns to Castro and Batista during the time of the revolution, supporting both sides, the mafia, on behalf of the mafia. And then afterwards, he was the one who went down and prevailed upon Castro to release Santos Traficante. So Jack Ruby has all kinds of connections with Cuba. And Frank Sturgis is from Cuba. His original name was Frank Fiorini. And so according to the witnesses, Prio is neck deep in all this. He's neck deep in Bay of Pigs. He's neck deep in the anti-Castro stuff with Jack Ruby and Frank Sturgis during the time of the revolution, and then the time afterwards, especially with Frank Sturgis. And so in 1977, the House Select Committee requested that he appear before the committee to testify. On April 5th, 6 days after de Mohrenschildt is found dead, which is on the same day Charles Nicoletti is found dead in Chicago, Prio is found dead outside the garage of his Miami Beach home. And all three of these guys were scheduled to appear before the committee. Officially, he killed himself, another suicide. It's unreal. So what we have here is a rash of very prominent individuals dying in the lead up to the House Select Committee. We're not sure about, some of them. William Harvey died of heart, according to the official report, he died of complications from heart disease. Okay. I'm suspicious of that because what we already know about that poison that the CIA had that would cause heart problems, that would cause someone to die of a heart seizure specifically. William Pauley, Charles Nicoletti, George de Mohrenschildt, Carlos Prio. I mean, these are guys, if there's a short list of House Select Committee assassination witnesses that they're going to call, these guys were on it, all of them. And starting with the first one, Sheffield Edwards. You follow the progression. Sheffield Edwards is really key because he is the link between the CIA and the mafia, right? And that's the direction that the CIA does not want the committee to go. They don't want anything trailing back to the CIA. They want the House Select Committee to conclude that it was the mafia that did it, that Oswald was involved, that these Cubans did it, but no ties to the CIA. So all the guys that have ties or have knowledge of the CIA's involvement in this are dying. Sheffield Edwards was CIA. George de Mohrenschildt was CIA. William Harvey was CIA. Charles Nicoletti was CIA. The only one who's not CIA in this is Carlos Prio, but he has knowledge of all. So we just talked about 5 guys, 4 of whom are directly tied into the CIA, worked for the CIA, or assets or agents or officers. I mean, Harvey was a full-fledged officer in the CIA. What are the odds that all 5 of these guys would die, 4 of them with direct links back to the CIA, and knowing what we already know, that they are dead set against any links going back to the CIA, keeping the CIA out of the conspiracy dragnet. What are the odds that all these guys would turn up dead? 2 of them, or 3 of them, one of them shot 3 times in the back of the head, Charles Nicoletti, 2 of them by suicide, 1 by heart disease, and 1 ostensibly by natural causes, which we've already learned the CIA had mastered through termination with extreme prejudice, the art of killing somebody and making it appear that they died of natural causes. What are the odds that all 5 of these guys would die in the lead up to the House Select Committee? I've said it before. In the world of intelligence, there is no such thing as coincidence. And there is no such thing. I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a second. Now, tomorrow we'll get into some more. That it even gets more and more suspicious as we go along. Okay, I mean, it becomes more obvious to me, and perhaps it'll be obvious to you as well. But anyway, that's a taste. That's day 1 of the culture of death around the House Select Committee. And we will do day 2 tomorrow. So check out my website, sphistory.com. Feel free to subscribe to this channel. It's free. Hit the thumbs up. Give me a comment if you have more information or anything to add. And hit the notification bell. And as I mentioned yesterday, tomorrow we will finish up House Select Committee and the body count. And then starting on Saturday, I will be taking a week-long break to go on spring break with my family. And we will return and pick up investigation number 6 on April 1st. So anyway, until tomorrow, hope everybody has a great day. Thank you. And we'll talk tomorrow. Goodbye.